Welcome back to Inspirational True Stories. Let's dive into an emotional journey of overcoming adversity and rediscovering self-worth. This is the story of Victoria, a woman who devoted her youth to building a family, only to find herself as the one who endured the most pain. So, what was that pain? What was her life like? Join me as we explore every detail of this journey and see how Victoria turned her suffering into the driving force for her rebirth. Let's get started right now. The warm, inviting scent of simmering tomato soup filled the modest kitchen as Victoria stirred the pot absent-mindedly. Her graceful movements, perfected over years of practice, were automatic now, devoid of joy. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying Richard's biting words from earlier that morning. What is this happening? The question lingered in her mind like a shadow she couldn't shake. Victoria had spent years building a home she thought would be filled with love and respect, but lately, all she felt was emptiness. Her husband, Richard, once attentive and kind, had grown cold, distant, and sharp-tongued. His once affectionate gaze now only held judgment. Her reflection in the window caught her eye, a faint silhouette of the woman she used to be. She barely recognized herself. Her once radiant smile, a beacon of warmth, was now a rarity. Dark circles framed her eyes, and her posture sagged under the weight of invisible burdens. She glanced at the clock. Richard would be home soon. The creak of the front door made her stomach tighten. His arrival brought not relief, but dread. As he entered the kitchen, his eyes scanned her disapprovingly. "Don't you think you should take better care of yourself?" he said, his tone cutting. Victoria froze, the ladle hovering over the pot. She forced a smile, swallowing the lump in her throat. "I was just finishing dinner," she replied softly, avoiding his gaze. "Maybe help with the bills, too," Richard continued, brushing past her to the dining table, "since I'm the only one doing that." The words hit her like a slap, though she was used to them by now. She set the table silently, her hands trembling as she placed the plates. Richard's dismissive attitude had become routine, but it didn't hurt any less. Later, as they sat down, the air between them was thick with unspoken tension. The clink of silverware against porcelain was the only sound. Victoria worked hard to keep her emotions in check, the mask of composure she wore daily beginning to crack. The next morning, as sunlight streamed through the kitchen window, Richard's words cut deeper than ever. He leaned against the counter, coffee mug in hand, his tone devoid of warmth. "Well, you've really let yourself go, haven't you?" he remarked, his eyes scanning her from head to toe. Victoria's cheeks burned with shame. She gripped the edge of the sink to steady herself. "I've been busy taking care of the house, making sure everything is fine for you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Cooking for the family is enough. Don't you think?" he scoffed, sipping his coffee. She turned to face him, her heart pounding. "You think that's all I do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Well, it's not like you're contributing financially," he snapped, walking out of the room before she could respond. Victoria stood there, tears welling in her eyes. She pressed a hand to her chest, trying to quell the storm building inside her. The home she'd poured her soul into now felt like a cage. That evening, Richard's cruelty extended beyond their private moments. At a family gathering, he delivered a stinging blow that left Victoria reeling. "Victoria has plenty of free time now, doesn't she?" he said with a smug grin, addressing their friends. "Lucky for me, I can keep things running." Laughter erupted around the room, but Victoria didn't join in. Her sister Claire caught her eye, a silent offer of support. Victoria forced a tight smile, her heart aching. Later, as they drove home, the tension boiled over. "You didn't have to say that," Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. "It's the truth," Richard retorted, Maybe it's time someone said it." His words echoed in her mind long after they returned home. As he fell asleep beside her, snoring softly, Victoria lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Tears streamed down her face, silent witnesses to her growing despair. The breaking point came 2 weeks later during yet another argument. Richard's words were sharper than ever, cutting through the last threads of Victoria's patience. "Looking at you reminds me of everything you've thrown away," he spat, his voice dripping with contempt. Victoria's hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. The room seemed to close in around her, the weight of years of sacrifice crashing down on her. "I gave up everything for you," she said, her voice rising. "My career, my dreams, everything, because you said we'd build a life together." Richard scoffed, dismissing her pain with a wave of his hand. That was the moment Victoria realized there was nothing left to fight for. That night, as Richard slept soundly, Victoria packed her belongings. Her movements were deliberate, each item placed carefully into her suitcase. She sat at the desk and wrote him a letter, her hand steady as she poured out her heart. "I'm sorry for your pain, but that is not why I came to see you today. How could I possibly be attached to a man like him? I wanted to improve. All I wanted to do was be respected by your presence. I'm sorry for your pain, but that is not why I came to see you today. I'm leaving." When the first light of dawn broke through the curtains, Victoria walked out of the house, her suitcase in hand. The weight on her chest lifted slightly with each step she took. The world outside was quiet, the streets bathed in the soft glow of early morning. Victoria inhaled deeply, the crisp air filling her lungs. For the first time in years, she felt a flicker of hope, a fragile but growing belief that she could rebuild her life. She hailed a cab and headed to Claire's house. As the car pulled away, she didn't look back. There was nothing left for her in that house. Inside her, something stirred, a small, resilient flame that refused to be extinguished. Victoria knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but for the first time, it was hers to walk. The words Richard had flung at her over breakfast that morning echoed in Victoria's mind as she sat in the dimly lit living room, staring blankly at the television. She couldn't focus on the news anchor's voice or the images flickering on the screen. All she could hear was his cold, unfeeling tone. "You've really let yourself go, haven't you?" The comment had struck like a knife, twisting deep within her. She ran her fingers through her once lustrous hair, now tied in a hurried bun. Was she really so unrecognizable? She had spent so much of her energy maintaining their home, catering to his needs, ensuring their lives ran smoothly, yet all he seemed to see were her flaws. Her hands, calloused from endless scrubbing and cooking, rested in her lap. She stared at them, her mind racing. Once, these hands had painted canvases, designed intricate patterns, and held the dreams of a bright future. Now they were little more than tools of service in a life that seemed to have forgotten her entirely. "How did we get here?" she whispered to the empty room, her voice quivering. Later that day, as Victoria prepared lunch, her movements were slow and methodical, each chop of the knife matching the rhythm of her fractured thoughts. She had always found solace in cooking, but even this familiar act felt hollow now. Richard's words had tainted the space where she once found comfort. If you find this video helpful, please share it with your friends and family so they can also benefit from this valuable insight. The sound of the front door slamming jolted her from her thoughts. Richard was home early. Her heart sank. His presence no longer brought relief or joy. Instead, it filled her with a quiet dread, like the ticking of a clock counting down to the next cutting remark. He walked into the kitchen, his tie already loosened, and surveyed her with a glance that sent a chill down her spine. "Lunch ready yet?" he asked, his voice devoid of warmth. "Almost," she replied, keeping her tone neutral. Richard leaned against the counter, crossing his arms. His gaze lingered on her, and Victoria felt the weight of his scrutiny. "You know," he began, his tone casual but laced with disdain, "it wouldn't hurt to try a little harder. You're home all day, after all." Victoria froze, the knife still in her hand. The comment was simple, but it carried the force of every unspoken insult he had hurled her way in recent months. She set the knife down carefully, her hands trembling. "I am trying," she said quietly, not looking at him. Richard chuckled, a sound that sent a fresh wave of humiliation washing over her. "Trying? If this is your version of trying, I'd hate to see you give up," he said, walking away before she could respond. As soon as she heard the door to his study click shut, Victoria sank into a chair at the kitchen table. Her breath came in shallow gasps and tears blurred her vision. She wiped them away quickly, as if even in her solitude she wasn't allowed to break down. Her mind raced with a storm of emotions, anger, sadness, and above all a crushing sense of powerlessness. She had tried so hard to be the perfect wife, to maintain the life they had built together, but it was never enough. Her sacrifices, her career, her aspirations seemed invisible to him, swallowed whole by his growing indifference. She thought back to the early days of their marriage. Richard had once been her safe haven, a man who supported her dreams and believed in her potential. They had spoken late into the night about their plans for the future, shared laughter over burnt dinners, and dreamed of a life filled with love and partnership. Now those memories felt like relics from a different lifetime. Is this what love is supposed to feel like? She asked herself, her thoughts spiraling. She imagined herself saying something to him, standing her ground. She played out the confrontation in her mind, hearing herself demand the respect she deserved. "Do you even see me anymore, Richard?" the imaginary Victoria would say, her voice firm, her eyes blazing with defiance. "I am more than just the woman who cleans your house and cooks your meals." But reality was far less forgiving. The Victoria sitting in the quiet kitchen felt small, insignificant, and painfully aware of how easily her voice could be drowned out by Richard's. As the afternoon wore on, Victoria forced herself to get up and resume her chores. She folded laundry, swept the floors, and prepared dinner, all while carrying the heavy burden of Richard's words. Each task felt like another brick in the wall that separated her from the life she had once envisioned. When she was done vacuuming, the floor was clean. Still, amidst the despair, a tiny ember of resolve began to flicker within her. She thought of her sister, Claire, who had always encouraged her to pursue her passions. "You're so talented, Victoria. Don't let that go to waste," Claire's words echoed in her mind. Victoria paused, her hands resting on the kitchen counter. When was the last time she had done something for herself? When had she last painted, designed, or even dreamed of a life beyond this suffocating existence? That evening, as they sat down to dinner, the tension between them was palpable. Victoria had prepared one of Richard's favorite dishes, hoping to bridge the growing chasm between them. "Roast chicken," Richard said as he took a bite. "At least you're consistent." Victoria's grip on her fork tightened, but she forced herself to stay calm. "I thought you liked it," she said, her voice steady. "It's fine," he replied with a shrug. "Just don't get too comfortable. I might start expecting more." The comment stung, but Victoria swallowed her retort. She glanced across the table at Richard, who ate without a trace of gratitude or acknowledgement of her efforts. For the first time, she realized just how deeply his words had burrowed into her soul. Each insult, each dismissive glance was eroding her sense of self, piece by piece. As the night wore on, Victoria found herself sitting alone in the living room again. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the dishwasher in the kitchen. She stared at her reflection in the darkened window, her thoughts swirling. "I can't keep living like this," she thought. "Something has to change." For the first time in months, she allowed herself to imagine a different future, one where she wasn't defined by Richard's approval, one where she could reclaim the parts of herself she had lost. Victoria didn't know how or when, but she knew she couldn't stay trapped in this cycle of humiliation and despair forever. And with that thought, the ember of hope within her began to glow just a little brighter. The evening air was cool as Victoria stepped onto the back porch. She wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders, the wool rough against her skin but comforting in its weight. The night sky, scattered with faint stars, seemed vast and indifferent, a stark contrast to the tight knot of emotions constricting her chest. She closed her eyes and inhaled deeply, savoring the brief respite of silence away from the house. Inside, the tension lingered like a ghost. Dinner had been another ordeal. Richard's words had been sharp, laced with the kind of cruelty he had perfected, a way of wounding her deeply without raising his voice. Tonight, he'd criticized her cooking again, this time in front of his parents during a small family dinner. "The roast was overdone," he had said, his tone casual yet pointed, earning a chuckle from his father. "But at least she didn't burn it this time." The remark hung in the air, stinging like a whip. Victoria had managed a tight smile, swallowing the retort that threatened to rise. She had grown used to these subtle digs, but the laughter that followed felt like nails on her skin. Claire, seated at the far end of the table, had offered Victoria a sympathetic look. It was the only balm to the humiliation burning in her chest. Now, standing on the porch, Victoria allowed herself to feel the full weight of the moment. Her hands gripped the railing as tears pricked her eyes. Why do I stay? The question echoed in her mind like a drum beat. Her life had become a series of compromises, a gradual erosion of the vibrant woman she once was. Each insult Richard hurled at her chipped away at her confidence, leaving behind a hollow shell of the person she used to be. Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of the sliding door. She turned to see Claire stepping out, her expression soft but concerned. "You okay?" Claire asked, her voice low. Victoria nodded quickly, brushing away the tears before they could fall. "I'm fine," she lied, her voice steady despite the storm raging inside her. Claire leaned against the railing beside her, silent for a moment before speaking again. "You don't have to keep pretending, you know." Victoria's lips parted, but no words came out. How could she explain the weight of it all? The shame of being trapped in a marriage that had turned toxic, the fear of what would happen if she left, and the faint but persistent hope that maybe, just maybe, Richard might change. The next evening, Victoria found herself in yet another social setting orchestrated by Richard. A dinner party, this time with some of his closest business associates. The dining room sparkled with polished silverware and fine china, but to Victoria the opulence only emphasized her isolation. She sat quietly at the far end of the table, offering polite smiles and the occasional nod. The conversation swirled around her. Discussions of mergers, stock markets, and vacations she could only dream of. Richard, seated at the head of the table, commanded the room effortlessly. His charm, the very trait that had once drawn Victoria to him, was now a weapon he wielded with precision. "Victoria's been keeping busy at home," Richard said, his voice carrying over the clinking of glasses, "though I do think she has a bit too much free time." Laughter erupted, and Victoria's cheeks flushed with humiliation. She gripped her napkin tightly, her knuckles turning white. One of the women seated nearby leaned toward her, a smirk playing on her lips. "I envy you, though. Must be nice not having to work." Victoria forced a smile, but the words felt like acid in her ears. "Yes, it's nice, she murmured, her voice barely audible. As the evening wore on, Victoria's emotions swirled like a storm within her. She excused herself from the table and slipped into the kitchen, where the sounds of laughter and conversation were muffled by the heavy door. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping the cool marble surface. Her breath came in shallow gasps as she tried to steady herself. "This isn't who I am," she thought, her mind racing. "This can't be my life." Memories of her younger self flooded her mind. A woman, full of ambition, creativity, and dreams. Where had that woman gone? She had given up so much for Richard, believing that their life together would be worth the sacrifices. But now, it felt like she had traded her identity for a marriage that had become her prison. She knew that the minute the marriage was over, she had given up so much for Richard, believing that their life would be worth the sacrifices. But now it felt like she had traded her identity for a marriage that had become her prison. Claire found her in the kitchen, her brow furrowed with concern. "You don't have to stay in there," Claire said softly, placing a hand on Victoria's arm. "Come sit with me." Victoria shook her head, tears threatening to spill over. "I can't, Claire. I can't face them." Claire's grip on her arm tightened slightly. "You deserve better than this, Victoria," she said, her voice firm. "You don't have to keep letting him treat you like this." The words hit Victoria like a jolt, igniting a spark of defiance within her. She looked at her sister, her eyes filled with a mixture of pain and determination. "But what if this is all I'll ever have?" Victoria whispered, her voice trembling. Claire shook her head. "It's not. It doesn't have to be. You're stronger than you think." The dinner party eventually ended, and as Victoria cleared the table, Richard approached her. His tie was loosened, and he held a glass of whiskey in one hand. "You know," he began, his tone casual, "you could have made a bit more effort tonight. It's embarrassing when you sit there looking uninvolved." Victoria froze, the stack of plates trembling in her hands. She turned to face him, her eyes burning with unshed tears. "I try, Richard," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. But nothing I do is ever good enough for you." He laughed, a cold, hollow sound. "Maybe because you stopped trying a long time ago." The plates slipped from her hands, shattering on the floor. The noise echoed through the room, but Victoria didn't flinch. She stared at him, her chest heaving with a mix of anger and despair. "You don't see me anymore," she said, her voice rising. "You don't see anything I do for you. You don't see how hard I've tried." Richard's expression darkened, but before he could respond, Victoria turned and walked out of the room. Later that night, as she lay in bed beside him, Victoria stared at the ceiling, her mind racing. The argument had left her shaken, but it had also planted a seed of clarity. "This can't be my life," she thought. "I can't keep living like this." For the first time, she allowed herself to imagine a future without Richard, a life where she could reclaim the parts of herself she had lost. It was a terrifying thought, but it was also the first flicker of hope she had felt in years. Victoria didn't know what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: something had to change, and for the first time she was ready to take the first step. The house was eerily quiet, save for the faint ticking of the clock in the living room. It was past midnight, and the world outside was wrapped in darkness. Victoria stood in the doorway of the bedroom she had shared with Richard for so many years, her suitcase open on the bed. The soft glow of the lamp illuminated her face, etched with a mixture of exhaustion and determination. Each item she packed felt like a small liberation: the silk scarf she used to wear to gallery openings, the leather-bound journal she hadn't touched in years, and the photo of her and Claire on a sunlit beach, all remnants of a life she had pushed aside to fit into Richard's world. As she placed her belongings into the suitcase, her movements were deliberate, each fold and tuck a quiet act of rebellion. The weight of years of sacrifice bore down on her shoulders. But for the first time in a long while, she felt her spine straighten with resolve. She sat down at the desk, a piece of crisp white paper in front of her. The pen in her hand felt heavy, its ink carrying the weight of words she had never dared to say aloud. "Richard," she began, her handwriting steady despite the tremble in her fingers. "For years I have tried to make this marriage work. I gave up everything for you, my career, my dreams, even my sense of self, because I believed in the life we could build together. But every cruel word, every dismissive glance, and every moment of humiliation has chipped away at the person I used to be." Her pen paused as she swallowed back the lump in her throat. The memories flooded her, of late nights waiting for Richard to come home, of biting her tongue as he belittled her in front of others, of crying silently in the shower so he wouldn't see her pain. "I refuse to let your words define me any longer. I deserve more than this life, more than being treated as an afterthought in my own home. By the time you read this, I'll be gone." She placed the pen down and stared at the letter. It wasn't perfect, but it was honest, a reflection of her pain and the strength she had finally found to leave it behind. As Victoria zipped her suitcase shut, her eyes lingered on the bed she had shared with Richard. She thought back to the early days of their marriage, the laughter, the passion, the endless conversations about their future. Back then, she had felt like an equal partner, like someone valued and cherished. But those days were gone, replaced by a cold, unyielding reality. "I gave up everything for you," she whispered to herself, her voice tinged with bitterness. The words hung in the air, a mantra of the past that no longer held power over her. Tonight, she wasn't giving anything up. She was reclaiming what she had lost. Just as she was about to leave the room, the bedroom door creaked open. Richard stood in the doorway, his brow furrowed. His eyes flicked to the suitcase on the bed, then back to her. "What's this?" he asked, his tone laced with irritation. Victoria met his gaze, her heart pounding. She had imagined this moment countless times, rehearsed the words she would say. Now, standing in front of him, she felt an unexpected calm wash over her. "I'm leaving," she said simply. Richard scoffed, crossing his arms. "Don't be ridiculous. Where are you even going to go?" Victoria straightened her shoulders, her voice steady. "I'll stay with Claire for now. After that, I'll figure it out. But I'm done living like this." His laugh was cold, dismissive. "You're overreacting as usual. This is just another one of your tantrums." For a brief moment, doubt flickered in her mind. But then she remembered the countless nights of loneliness, the cruel remarks, the endless cycle of trying and failing to earn his approval. "This isn't a tantrum," she said, her voice firm. "This is me finally choosing myself." Richard's expression shifted, the smugness replaced by something that looked almost like fear. "You're really going to throw everything away? After all I've done for you?" Victoria let out a bitter laugh. "What you've done for me? You've done nothing but tear me down. I've spent years trying to be the perfect wife, sacrificing my happiness for yours, and all you've ever done is make me feel like I'm not enough." Richard opened his mouth to respond, but Victoria held up a hand, stopping him. "No more, Richard. I'm done being your punching bag. I'm done trying to fix something that you broke. I deserve better than this." She grabbed her suitcase and walked past him, her heart pounding in her chest. She didn't look back as she descended the stairs, each step feeling like a victory. The air outside was crisp, biting against her skin as she stepped onto the driveway. The weight of the suitcase in her hand was nothing compared to the weight that had been lifted from her heart. Claire's car was waiting at the curb, her sister's silhouette visible through the windshield. Victoria walked toward the car, her steps steady and sure. As she reached the car, she turned back for one last look at the house. The porch light cast a dim glow, illuminating the place that had been her prison for so many years. "Goodbye," she whispered, the word carrying with it all the pain, anger, and hope she had held inside. The drive to Claire's house was quiet, the hum of the car engine filling the silence. Victoria stared out the window, the dark streets rushing past. For the first time in years, she felt a glimmer of something she thought she had lost forever. Freedom. "You okay?" Claire asked softly, breaking the silence. Victoria turned to her sister, a small smile tugging at the corners of her lips. "I will be," she said, her voice steady. As they pulled into Claire's driveway, Victoria felt a sense of relief wash over her. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew she was finally on the path to finding herself again. That night, as she lay in the guest room bed, Victoria allowed herself to dream. For the first time in years, the dreams weren't about fixing a broken marriage or meeting someone else's expectations. They were about her passions, her goals, her happiness. And as she drifted off to sleep, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. We bring our message to everyone. It is never too late to change your life. With faith, courage, and support, you can turn pain into strength and find light even in the darkest days.